Hello, Oregon sports fans, and welcome to a new edition of the Oregonian Sports Podcast. I'm Joe Freeman, senior writer for the Oregonian and Oregon Live, and we're here today to talk a little Trailblazers. Or, more specifically, we're here to talk about Tom Dundon, the man positioned to become the Trailblazers' new owner. The billionaire businessman from Texas heads a group of investors who have agreed to buy the team from the Paul Allen estate for more than $4 billion. It will be the second major professional sports franchise that Dundon owns, joining the Carolina Hurricanes, who play in the NHL. When the sale is complete, it will be the first time since 1988 that the Blazers will be owned by someone outside the Allen family. Who is Tom Dundon? What can Blazers fans expect under his ownership? Joining me to answer those questions and more is Luke DeCock, a longtime sports columnist at the News and Observer in Raleigh, North Carolina, who has covered the Carolina Hurricanes throughout Dundon's ownership. Luke, thanks so much for joining me today, man. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me, Joe.
Yeah, cool. Well, I mean, there are few people who can offer more insight, I think, into what for Oregonians is this unknown, very soon to be very public figure in town and an important figure for sports fans. I guess to start, before we look ahead at what things might be like in the future under his ownership, we might as well hop in our DeLorean and kind of go back in time and chat about what things, have been like with the Hurricanes since he took control of the team. You've been around since before he took over. Can you kind of paint us a picture of what state the franchise was in before he arrived? And I guess just how would you describe the way he approached the early days of his ownership?
Yeah, it's interesting because he was very much an unknown figure here too, much as he is in Portland at this point. I mean, there had been a previous sort of bid to buy the team over the summer before he bought it. Another guy from Dallas, actually. And no one really knew about him. He hadn't been on the radar. I honestly, to this day, 7 years later, 6, whatever it is, still don't know where Gary Bettman found him, in terms of connecting Tom Dundon with an NHL franchise. But the Hurricanes were in pretty dire shape. They'd missed the playoffs 9 years in a row. They were going to miss it 10. They had some good young players, but they were one of the lowest payroll teams in the league. They were always around the cap floor. They'd been owned since they moved to North Carolina by a guy named Peter Karmanos, who had bought the Hartford Whalers, moved them to North Carolina in 1997, a very acrimonious sort of divorce from the state of Connecticut that Whalers fans are still bitter about. And then, sort of through 2002, through the lockout in 05-06 that shut down the league for a year, the Hurricanes could sort of compete financially. In fact, the year they won the Stanley Cup was the first year of the salary cap in the NHL. In 2002, they went to the Stanley Cup Finals. They lost to the Detroit Red Wings, who had a payroll about 3 times of the Hurricanes. So, they were always sort of economically up against it. And then what sort of happened over the course of Karmanos' ownership, 2 things happened. One, his company, which was a company called CompuWare in Detroit, they made software for mainframe computers. And as you can imagine, that was a growth industry around Y2K for the people who remember the big Y2K crisis that didn't happen. Once that passed, people were not buying a lot of software for mainframe computers in 2002. They were buying computers that soon would sit in their pocket and do about as much. So his business sort of tanked. He ended up getting forced out as chairman in another very acrimonious divorce, and was sort of running out of personal finances. And then his silent partner, the co-founder of CompuWare, was a close friend of Karmanos and had basically been his 50-50 silent partner in the Hurricanes. He died, and his family wanted their share of the estate. The problem was, even though the Hurricanes weren't worth a ton by NHL standards at that point, Karmanos didn't have the money to buy them out. So what happened is you had this sort of slow bleeding to death of the Hurricanes, where they couldn't afford to invest in players. They couldn't afford to keep their players. They did not have the best player development system. They were basically hamstrung financially on every front. And this went on for a period of almost a decade. In 2006, obviously, they won the Stanley Cup. 2009, they went to the conference finals. 2011, they hosted the NHL All-Star Game in what was this sort of triumph of the non-traditional franchise. Here was this team that had been to the Final Four twice in recent years. They'd won the Stanley Cup. They'd overcome these 2 years. They played in Greensboro and nobody went while the arena was being built in Raleigh, and they were this total laughingstock. 2011, things looked pretty good. That's right when Karmanos ran out of money. So the next sort of 7 to 8 years were pretty grim, or 6 to 7 years. Finally, in the summer of 2018, Karmanos got serious about selling the team, which he had resisted for a long time. And then Dundon was sort of the second person to come in kicking the tires. So the franchise was in extremely bad shape. Every time the Montreal Canadiens came to town, there would be this flurry of the Hurricanes are moving to Quebec rumors, just regular as clockwork. We all knew where they were coming from. But Karmanos really didn't want to move the team. He didn't want to sell it to someone who would move it. He's very personally invested in the team's success in North Carolina. And we had seen for a period of time here that it could work and that it could be this sort of unifying force among NC State and North Carolina and Duke fans. So my argument to readers and to Dundon when I first met him in sort of December of 2017, I said summer of 2018, summer of 2017. Dundon bought the team in January of 2018. So I'm getting my years kind of confused there. But that's
close enough.
Timeline.
What's a year here or there over time? No big deal.
And honestly, things have changed so much since then. It seems like decades ago now. But
sure
my
does.
argument was always that this market was dormant. It wasn't dead, that it was a good market for hockey, that it had proven that. And if it had the right owner, that it probably was going to be okay. So that was the sort of situation that Tom Dundon walked into. This sort of dying on the vine, under-financed, under-resourced franchise that had treated its fans pretty poorly for a period of about a decade. And there was this almost Stockholm syndrome among Hurricanes fans. There's still some residual effects of this to this day where, they would bring in these terrible players or these horrible, lazy players, and fans or guys who literally, they brought in a goalie who literally could not play. Like he ended up basically in therapy. He was so bad. The fans would put themselves in these positions of defending these players because if they didn't, they would sort of be like have to question their own sanity. So it was a very toxic situation, very grim. And in some ways, it reminds me a little bit to my very limited knowledge here of what's gone on with the Trailblazers over the past, few years or so, where you've had some talented young players come through. You've had this foundation of past glory where the team was just an absolute pillar of the community. And then you have some ownership issues and some competitive issues and some off-court / off-ice issues. And things kind of snowball. And then you get to a point where, and this is what you're going to learn about Tom Dundon, the Blazers become a distressed asset. And there is nothing on the planet Tom Dundon likes better than a distressed asset. It's how he's always made his money. It's how he ended up in this AAF fiasco that's now in bankruptcy court. And it's how he bought the Hurricanes. He bought them low, will someday sell them high, and saw a franchise that once had success. It was the only pro team in its market, brought together a bunch of different fan bases. And there was a real estate play involved. And I don't know enough about the Blazers to know to what degree that's true. But, here we are 7 years later. We've got a team that's made the playoffs every single year, every single full season since he bought them. They spend to the cap. They pursue marquee free agents. And they've got a $2 billion real estate development going on outside, in addition to $300 million of renovations to the building that wouldn't have happened if the Hurricanes hadn't signed what's essentially a 40-year lease. So, you've just seen the entire franchise pivot from this sort of, it was kind of like Ma and Pa Joe driving down the road in the pickup truck with all the furniture strapped to the back, which is exactly what the Detroit Free Press depicted the franchise as in 2002, an absolutely terrible Mitch Albom column called Moonshine in Me, where he basically lampooned the entire idea of hockey anywhere south of Columbus, and really should have gotten a lot more criticism for that than he did. But now you've got this very smoothly running, analytically focused, aggressive franchise that's come within a couple games of the Stanley Cup Finals, but hasn't gotten over the hump yet. So very much a pivot from one of the worst run, least financed, most sort of dejected franchises in the league to maybe not a model franchise, but they really do squeeze every nickel out of the market now. And I mean that in a good way. I mean, they've found ways to make money. And, it hasn't been smooth. I mean, in his first year, he fired the coach, the GM, and the radio guy. And
the TV guy too, right? TV play-by-play guy.
That was a year later. That was during COVID.
Okay.
But yes, eventually, yeah. So it hasn't always been smooth. but he's put a competitive team on the ice for a longer period of time than this franchise had ever seen, even in his best years. After going to the finals in 2002 and winning the Cup in 2006 and going to the conference finals in 2009, it didn't make the playoffs the next year in any of those. So this is the most sustained success this franchise has ever seen, going back to the Whalers days. And, they've brought back the Whalers gear, right? There was no personal issues there like Carmanos had with the Whalers. So that was free money. There was a game his first year where there were like 7,000 people in the building, and he told everybody, just come on down and grab a seat in the lower bowl. Like, I'd rather have people down here where the players can see him than up in their cheap seats. They've had incredible guerrilla marketing. So Don Cherry, who's thankfully been moved off into some sort of wildlife preserve now, but was sort of the Canadian, reactionary guerrilla for many, many years on the hockey scene. So when they were doing the first full season, they were doing post-game celebrations. They called the Storm Surge. They do the Viking clap, and then they jump into the glass, or they started having very elaborate skits involving, Evander Holyfield and whoever else happened to be in town and props and whatever. And Don Cherry's
almost like minor league baseball-esque.
Yeah, or like not quite Savannah Bananas, but just in this very one little narrow thing, they would sort of ham it up after these games. And, Dundon's position was, why not? Like, we have to do something to distinguish ourselves here. And they don't really do it anymore. They just sort of do the clap after wins and jump into the boards. But it got pretty elaborate that first year, and Don Cherry called them a bunch of jerks. They had bunch of jerks t-shirts on sale within 36 hours. And people bought them and wore them. And it became a slogan. So that sort of guerrilla marketing, this franchise never had the flexibility. It was never nimble enough to pull something like that off. So, it's been a big change. And as I said, there, I don't think fans would be unanimous in their love of him. I don't think fans ever love any owner.
Yeah, no owner's universally beloved, no matter where.
Sort of like being the commissioner of a league. Yeah. But the results speak for themselves. This has been one of the 4 or 5 best teams in the league for a 5 or 6 year period running now, and the coach deserves a lot of credit. But the fact is, they have been a cap team every year of those years, and they never were before.
One thing, a lot to unpack from that. One thing that I kind of wonder, it's a lot for Blazers fans. There was a large fear, or a certain segment of the fan base had a fear that the team legitimately could relocate. And I think that fear still percolates, and until a long-term lease is signed, until, a new arena or a remodeled arena or whatever avenue Tom Dundon decides to pursue, assuming he takes over control of the team, I think that will continue to linger. I wonder, was that a very real threat in Raleigh for you guys, when he took over? And in terms of the lease and everything he did, he had to negotiate a new lease. He agreed to develop the land around the arena, and he agreed to, renovate the arena there. So, how did all that come together? I'm sure it's a very easy question with a complicated answer, but how real was the relocation possibility, and how did he go about, securing the team's future there?
Yeah, it's almost 2 separate answers. I think the relocation potential certainly was perceived to be very real, both before and after he bought the team. And I don't know, in his heart of hearts, if you were to pin him down somewhere and ask him, when you bought the team, did you think in 5 years you would be in Houston or you would be in Austin? This is someone who lives in Dallas and has very deep roots there. And my guess is he would have said, well, I thought there was a chance. In part because you have to remember, when he bought the team, it was
a mess.
It was a mess.
Yeah.
Yes.
It was a mess.
And so there wasn't sort of that guarantee that they would be where they are now. And so I think that, he was never going to move into Quebec. He was never going to move into Salt Lake City. I think there were a couple places, Houston and Austin, I think probably made the most sense. But I don't know.
A Dallas man moving something to Houston, that just doesn't seem right to me.
No, but he obviously, with the stars there, where you were going to have limited options.
Yeah.
So, and Houston at one point, it may still be, is the biggest U.S. market without a hockey team. There's a lot of sort of economic factor driving that. Austin built this gorgeous new arena for the University of Texas that the Oakview Group controls. They'd love to have a pro team in there. And again, it's another place where there's the only pro team in the market is an MLS team. You may be competing for corporate money. You're not competing on a season by season sort of ticket sales basis. Houston,
Sure.
obviously, much more competitive market with the Rockets and obviously NFL and MLB and all of that. But the arena stuff was really complicated. It was very political. The arena here is owned by a government entity. It was built by the city, state, and county, or by the state and county, with money from NC State, with money from Peter Karmanos. It's a very complicated government bureaucracy that manages the arena. What happened in conjunction with Dundon buying the team, a couple things. Number one, the authority got a new chairman who was very politically connected and very committed to keeping the team here. Not that previous chairmans hadn't. This guy was willing to kind of break some eggs to make the omelet and move fast.
Kind of emotionally invested in a way.
Yeah. Also, just there was a bit of a generational adjustment. The previous chairman was an older man who'd been the city lawyer for a long time, believed in procedure and doing things very methodically. And for a long time, especially when the Karmanos situation was deteriorating, that was exactly what the arena needed. It needed a steady hand because things could go south at any time. When Dundon came in, that is not his métier. Like, he wants to move fast. He wants to do things. Why is this taking so long? And the new chairman was very much on that wavelength. There were two things that had to happen here, and this gets into really complicated North Carolina politics. But Dundon wanted the right to develop the land around the arena. This arena, you guys would know, it has sat surrounded by nothing but parking lots for 25 years. There's not a bar you can walk to. There's not a restaurant. There's not a hotel. It's all just asphalt. And that's great for NC State football because their football stadium is literally right across the street. It's where they played the outdoor hockey game in 2023. People love to tailgate. They have a tremendous tailgating culture that's spilled over to the Hurricanes, who also have a tremendous tailgating culture. But if you're the kind of person who would rather have a beer indoors on a rainy day, you don't have that option. There's not even stuff on the outside of the arena that you can go to. So this was a huge real estate play for Dundon. He figured out once the team got stabilized, so this is sort of coming out of COVID, you could, without a ton of heavy lifting, do a billion, 2 billion, nickels and dimes to a guy like that, of mixed use development around this arena. And it was like a license to print money. To do that, you're going to have to sign a long-term lease. That meant the team was staying here. You also, if you were going to do that, wanted the city and state, and this is where it starts getting tricky, to put money in to renovate the arena. It is not a team-owned arena. This is not one of those deals where an owner's got his hand out asking for money to renovate his kitchen. This is a taxpayer-owned arena in a situation where hotel and restaurant tourism taxes pay for renovations to the arena. But the city and state, I keep saying city, county and state have to release that money. That money also goes to the convention center. There was a proposal to build a soccer stadium. There's all kinds of things that want that money. So you had this sort of three-way dance between Dundon, who wanted to develop the land, the arena authority that wanted him to sign a long-term lease, the politicians that wanted him to sign a long-term lease before they would release the money, and NC State, which wouldn't sign off on any of this unless their tailgate parking was protected. So you have this $2 billion deal held up over parking spots, which is just sums up politics in Raleigh so well.
Very 1970-ish of them.
Yeah, just some of that is just NC State's way of thinking about things. Some of it was legitimate. To this day, I'm shocked that the NC State chancellor didn't get more out of this deal because he really did kind of have them over a barrel. And NC State only charges like $400 a year for those parking spots anyway. So I'm not sure how valuable they really are. Long and short of it is, thanks in large part to this authority chairman, to Dundon's willingness to play ball and bargain, to a very influential consultant that the Arena Authority hired to kind of grease all these wheels and figure out where the power lies. I mean, there were like 13 state departments involved in these negotiations. Agriculture, administration, because of this is all on state land.
Sure.
All right, that's way too detailed. The point is they were able to sort of untie this very complicated knot where the state and county would release $300 million to renovate the arena. Dundon would sign this very long-term lease and agree to start paying rent, which is something the Hurricanes had never done. They've been, as part of their deal to move there, they'd gotten a sweetheart deal on the arena. Now they're going to pay rent. Now they're going to pay taxes. And then he gets to develop the land and make all that money, and the state is going to, signs over like a 200-year lease to him on the land. So this was an absolutely pivotal thing that had to happen for the future of the Hurricanes. Once it happened, they're here. The next part of the deal that's triggered is like 2039. There's a good faith agreement to explore either a ground to ceiling renovation of the arena or the construction of a new arena. So it's like, not only does this sort of secure the team's future for the next 3 or 4 decades, it kind of is set up for what's going to happen next, even after potentially Dundon sells the team. Now, there's no reason for him to sell right now because he's got this real estate play in progress.
Sure.
But, in the long term, if he decides he wants to buy an NFL team and needs the money or whatever, the franchise is locked in here, not only for the lifetime of the current building, but really into whatever replaces it. So that's why this is such a complicated but important deal, and why there are so many politicians involved. But they got it across the line a couple summers ago, and they've actually started the renovations during the playoffs this year, and now everything's sort of underway. So the first parking decks, the hated parking decks, will go up as soon as NC State's football season is over this year. But that's sort of, as you said, there's a really long answer to this. But what it shows to me, and I think this is what's relevant for Trailblazers fans, is if Dundon sees a way to make money, there are a lot of concessions that he will make that some owners wouldn't. And so, to the extent that, the building has issues, that there's real estate around the building that can be developed, that the city controls or the Trailblazers control or whoever control, those are going to be paths forward for him to get the most out of this investment.
Okay. Well, it sounds like the next time we record a podcast, we should do it in one of those brand new bars that are going to be located in those old parking lots there in Raleigh.
We'll see when the bars show up, but for now, yeah.
This all kind of makes me, you talk about, him wanting to make money. It's very clear as a person who has a background in finance and owns an investment firm, that is obviously a big part of him buying the Trailblazers. But, this is a guy who has his iron in a lot of fires. Like I mentioned, he owns an investment firm. He made his money years ago in subprime, auto lending backing and so on and so forth. Real estate. He owns and built a golf course in Dallas. He owns the Hurricanes, part owner of Top Golf and Pickleball, professional pickleball, I want to say. Is that right?
Yeah, no, he's big investor in pickleball.
Okay. So, he's everywhere, it seems. And so a couple things come to mind when I hear that. Does he love basketball? Will he be emotionally invested? And do you expect him to be hands-on in Portland, much like he seemed to be, certainly in the early days there with the Hurricanes?
Yeah, and still is with the Hurricanes. I mean, he's very involved sort of in player transactions and strategy. He's not just one of the reasons that the original GM got fired, I mean, in addition to not being great at his job, was that he wanted total power over player decisions, all decisions really on the hockey side. And Dundon very much didn't want that. Dundon wanted to have the final say on anything they did. One example I'll give is the first draft after he bought the team. This is in Dallas in 2018. Hurricanes had the second pick in the draft. That was a big deal. They're going to get this Russian kid they really liked. Dundon had sort of gone into that process expecting to trade down. He's a big believer in trading down, turning one asset into two, et cetera, but they really like this Russian kid. But the draft in the NHL is less about who you draft. These kids are all 18. It's really a convention where you get your deals done for the summer, a lot of your free agent legwork done. He told two agents, they had two restricted free agents, good young players. He told both of their agents, this is, I think the night of the first round, take the deal tonight or we're trading your guy. This is it. And neither of them believed him, because restricted free agent negotiations are something that tend to drag on until the season starts.
Sure.
Neither of them believed him. And the next morning they traded them both to the Calgary Flames, who were coached by the guy who the Hurricanes had just fired and all the players hated. So it was, there's very much a statement of that was all Tom. I mean, that was a message Tom wanted to send to the league. So he is very involved in
Player personnel moves,
player personnel direction. The one example is one year the Toronto Maple Leafs were trying to get rid of a contract for this guy Patrick Marleau, who was a very old, very talented, but end of his career player with a very big salary, and the Leafs had to get rid of him. Hurricanes traded for Marleau and a first-round pick and bought him out because they had cap space available at that time, and the Leafs didn't. So they basically paid, I think it was $3.5 million, $4 million for a late first-round pick. And that was like music to Dundon's ears. If we can turn money into assets without giving anything up, like, let's do that. Like, that's so, and that was at the time in the league that it's more common now, pretty rare then. So, his attention has been very focused on the Hurricanes, even with pickleball, even with the AAF debacle where he bought this football league and then basically shut it down when he couldn't do a deal with the NFL, and that is now getting sued in bankruptcy court over it by Charlie Ebersol and a couple other people. I don't know how hands-on he'll be with the Blazers, and I say that for two reasons. Number one is I think he had a very low opinion of NHL people. He didn't know a lot about the game, but he knew enough to know that most coaches and general managers weren't very good at their jobs. He knows more about basketball. He's a pretty good basketball player. He plays in a rec league, sort of billionaire pickup game with Mark Cuban, among others, in Dallas. My guess is he has a little more faith in the basketball people than he does hockey people. I also, that the Hurricanes needed a lot of attention. He's going to have to make an assessment on how much attention the Trailblazers need. I do think, from the little I know about the Trailblazers and the current state of the franchise and the way things have gone sort of under the estate, a lot of his playbook in Raleigh, both competitively and on the business side, I think will work in Portland. I may be part of the reason why this was attractive to him. That the business about being the only winter pro sport, the only major league team, does give you some opportunities to do things that you don't have in markets where there's more competition. That has nothing to do with the Timbers or baseball or anything. When you have that sort of flagship status in a market, I think there's things that he's learned from the Hurricanes that he can do with the Trailblazers. So the answer to your question is I don't know, because the Hurricanes have been so important to him and such a big part of his process. But he also is pretty experienced at having a lot of irons in the fire. I mean, he was doing this AAF stuff, buying the league and stuff in the middle at like the NHL trade deadline where he was very involved there. The timing was similar, not exact, but so it's not out of his wheelhouse if he wanted to be super involved with the Trailblazers and the Hurricanes at the same time. The Hurricanes also require less of his attention than they did 6-7 years ago. He's got a CEO in place now who he trusts. He's got a president in place who he trusts. He's got a GM who he trusts. He's got a coach who he trusts. The infrastructure in Raleigh is much more self-sufficient than it was when he bought the team. And that does make a difference. He
kind of did the heavy lifting when he arrived, and now he's got it in a position where he feels comfortable about its status and where it's headed. And so he can kind of take a step back in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that doesn't mean like on June 30th, the night before free agency in the NHL, he's not on his phone till 4 a.m. and part of every single conversation with the GM. But it may mean that, sort of here we are, a couple of weeks away from the first preseason game. He's probably not worried about how they're marketing the opener like he would have been.
Sure. A couple things through the course of talking have piqued my interest. One, you mentioned that he does spend. Essentially, you said he spends on players. He spends to the top of the cap in for the Hurricanes, and the use of analytics. My understanding is he's a very analytics driven businessman and has such been with the Hurricanes and seemingly will be with the Blazers as well. I guess just those two subjects. How pervasive is analytics and what he does, and just the use of spending money. What's his reputation there? Obviously, he wants to spend on players, but you mentioned that he kind of laid off some broadcasters and coaches and GMs. So how does he kind of approach those areas?
Yeah, the analytics is pretty simple. He was very analytically driven in the subprime auto loans business. I mean, that was really his advantage, was the ability to sort of look at the metrics, look at the numbers, figure out where the inefficiencies were. And that's basically what made him a billionaire in some ways. Hurricanes had a strong analytics staff. That's one thing the previous GM, actually, the GM he inherited, actually had done well. But Dundon identified that when he got there, that, okay, this guy, primarily the guy who's now the GM, knows what he's talking about. But they were far more empowered under Dundon. And the Hurricanes have a reputation in the NHL of being sort of a spreadsheet team. You know, they look for inefficiencies, they moneyball everything. So, you know, you look at who they draft. Every other team is looking to draft like big 6'4" wingers because you only get them in the draft. Who are the Hurricanes drafting? They're drafting 5'11" guys with really high skill who they think, if we can draft 10 of these guys and one of them turns into a player, that's better than using our draft pick on big, slow guys who can't skate. And they draft Russians because ever since Ukraine, people have stayed away from Russians in the NHL. They're harder to scout. They're harder to get over here. There's always issues. It's never easy. But the Hurricanes are like, you know, if we can get a Russian in the third round who normally would be a second-round pick, we're going to do that. And frankly, their best rookie next year is a Russian defenseman they got in the second round. So they've had some success following those things. But they are, you know, you and I joking when we talked earlier, the Moneyball scene where you've got, you know, I never remember the kid's name, but the analytics guy is sitting there behind Brad Pitt, and they're all sitting around the table with the scouts, and they're like, what about this guy? And Brad Pitt just looks at the analytics guy for the answer. Peter Brand, the fake, the guy who ended up being the GM of the Dodgers. But the analytics is really the deciding factor in a lot of this stuff now. And they've invested in that staff. I mean, a lot of what they're doing now. Now, you got to understand, their GM is a former hockey blogger who became the Hurricanes analytics guy, who has a PhD in chemistry and like 38 patents. Like before
fascinating.
Before
sounds incredibly interesting.
Before he came to the Hurricanes, he was working on like electric battery lithium technology, like it's like nanotechnology. So not a guy who grew up playing the game. This is a guy who found ways to look at and describe hockey using numbers. And then, he and Dundon, sort of jived right away. So, it is a very analytically driven franchise that spends a lot of money on staff and computing power, and works really hard to sort of develop their own bespoke, qualitative measures and analytics. And then, I asked him one time, one of the big things in the NHL, the NBA has kind of been through this already. One of the big things in the NHL is the player tracking cameras. So now we're going to have data derived from cameras as opposed to sort of shots and saves and whatever. So we can sort of track player and puck positions on the ice and things like that. And NBA and college basketball, synergy and stuff like that. I've been doing a better job of that for years. But hockey's kind of getting to that. And I asked him one time, like, how much of your staff and your time is spent sort of on the player day? And he's like, oh, you're like, he was almost like getting pat on the head. Like we're way past that.
So Luke, we're so in the future there. Yeah.
Like that's so 2021. So, that the focus there is very heavy, to the point where the analytics guy eventually became the GM. The money thing is interesting. The thing that Tom will say, and fans have a hard time understanding this at times. Tom will say the money goes to the team. The money goes on the ice. And they will spend, they will literally, and other NHL teams do this, but they've really pushed the envelope on it. On sort of roster cut down day in October, they will call up random dudes and send down veteran players so they can maximize their injury relief under the cap to the nickel. They have really, really pushed the edge on this to get the maximum amount of injury relief. And other teams would send a guy down or whatever to kind of push this. They've really, really gone to the far edge of the envelope with this stuff. When he got here, the radio guy was a Hall of Famer, very beloved in the community. Tom said, we don't even need a radio broadcast. You're making too much money. Offered him a deal where basically the radio guy could make as much as he was making before, but he's going to have to sell ads to make up the difference between that and what Tom wanted to pay him. And the guy wouldn't do it. And Tom was like, fine, we'll simulcast. So the next year they simulcast the TV broadcast. A couple of years later, when the TV play-by-play, not a Hall of Famer, but a future Hall of Famer, does a lot of national work. When his contract came up, Tom basically said, "This is what I'm willing to pay you." He wouldn't do it. He left, and they promoted the sideline reporter to be the play-by-play guy right in the middle of COVID. So he can be very ruthless when it comes to things that do not affect competitiveness. During COVID, they basically furloughed a lot of their lower level staff while other teams were paying, salaries and things like that. That got a lot of blowback. So, and then I should mention this, after he bought the team, he fires the GM who didn't kind of want to do things his way. Wasn't doing the greatest job, if we want to be honest about it anyway. Went on about a 3-month sort of dating game of talking to every potential GM candidate in the league, and he was very firm. I'm not going to pay the going rate for a GM. Going rate for a GM at the time, well, I can't honestly remember the numbers. Let's say it was $1 million, $1.5 million a year or something like that. He's like, these guys are all the same. They're all replacement level. I will find someone who can do this job for less than that. Came very close to hiring the guy who ended up going to the Florida Panthers and winning the Stanley Cup. So, the people he identified were really good. Ended up basically taking the team president, who was the interim GM, former GM of the Atlanta Thrashers, giving him the job. And they ended up working out just fine. They made the playoffs. The coaches, he hired Rod Brindamore, who was an assistant coach, franchise legend, should be in the Hall of Fame, for some reason isn't. The spring of 24, Brindamore's contract was up. He was one of the lowest paid coaches in the league. He went on his own little power play where he basically said, "I'm not going to re-sign. I will leave and go to the Maple Leafs or whoever if I don't get market rate." And this, I broke the story in the middle of the second round of the playoffs, which is not exactly when you want those, maybe first round of the playoffs, not exactly when you want that stuff to break. But it was a story that got out there because they thought they had a deal and then it fell apart and people were pissed. You would think that this would be an easy negotiation, give the guy what he wants. But that didn't happen that way. It ended up working out. He ended up getting what he wanted for himself and for his assistants. But it was this sort of hairy situation for a little bit. So that's where Dundon sort of gets the reputation for being cheap. Certainly in like contract negotiations with his own players, that those can be difficult. He is going to fight you on everything. They've lost players because of that. I think there's actually been a little bit of moderation with that since last year. But in the end, it's not a question of he won't pay players. It's how the money is divided up. You're going to spend to the cap anyway. They have $10 million in cap space right now, but it's only because there's no one out there to spend it on. If there was a guy that they could trade for or a player they could sign who was worth it, they would. They were at the cap last year and they were at the cap the year before. So, and before that. So it's a really interesting dichotomy in the sense that fans will always be like, "Oh, Dundon, he's so cheap." But then it's kind of like, do you realize that he's spending like 3 times on payroll what they were spending in 2018? And that's raw numbers. I mean, in terms of the relative numbers, it's basically twice what they were spending back then. Which, when you think about it in the context of a professional league, if we have a team and we can have another team just like it and take the best players from both, we're probably going to be a better team. Like, the competitive aspect of it is insane. So, and they moved the AHL team from Charlotte to Chicago because they got a better deal on it. Like, does it make more sense to have your AHL team in Charlotte for 8 million reasons? Yes. Was there a financial angle to having it in Chicago? Yes. So they moved to Chicago. So things like that pop up occasionally. But in the end, the money does go to the team. And I think there's probably been a lesson or two learned in there of sometimes you just got to bite the bullet. If he has a weakness as an owner, I mean, to me, he occasionally has the idea that hockey players, and this is even more true in the NBA where you have a smaller pool of players to draw from, sometimes kind of gets in his head that hockey players are like investments. He may look at 100 deals a day and do one. You can, if you don't like the terms of a company you're trying to buy or debt you're trying to acquire, you can just walk away and do a different deal. There's a billion deals out there. if you don't like what a right shot defenseman is asking from you to resign, and he wants $5 million and you think he's a $4 million player, and you say, fine, go to that team that'll give you $5 million. There's not necessarily a player worth $4 million out there to give $4 million to. You might now have $4 million to spend, and the next best alternative is a guy who's worth $2.5 million. And guess what? Now he wants 3. So I think there's been a bit of a learning experience there that there isn't a limitless pool of players or assets the way there is in the business world. I think it's even more true in the NBA, because in the NBA, the drop off from sort of, and obviously stars are stars, but I think in the NBA, the drop off from sort of 4 to 5 and 5 to 6 and 6 to 7 on your bench is probably even more stark than the drop off from sort of 10 to 12 to 14 to 16 on a 23-man NHL roster. You're always going to have 5 guys on your roster who are right at the cusp of replacement level. It's just the way it works. In the NBA, obviously it's a little more top heavy. So, telling your 6th man you're not going to pay him like a starter could have real consequences when there just simply isn't a player that you can get for a reasonable price to replace it.
Yeah, I guess the long and short of kind of everything we've talked about indirectly is and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like one thing that people have made clear to me about Tom is that he's all about winning above all else almost, and maybe not above making money, but perhaps one would argue winning fuels making money. It seems to me that that's what drives him in these situations. Does that sound about right to you? I mean, how would you describe his competitiveness?
Yeah, I mean, I think if they thought Pol Pot was going to score 35 goals, they would sign him. Like, there's just, it is very much a whatever it takes to win mentality. I do think part of that is his own personal competitiveness. I think part of that is for us to succeed in this market without, going up against New York and Toronto and Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, these much bigger cities with much bigger corporate bases, which is really the difference there. The fan-wise, I mean, the Hurricanes are in the top 5 in attendance. They sell every ticket they need to sell. What it comes down to is corporate support in those sort of big mega corporate hubs. Winning helps with that too. Like, if you want deals with national sponsors, which is kind of what you have to do here. Lenovo has its name on the building. That's your biggest consumer-facing local company. IBM has a huge presence here, but they're not headquartered here. There are a lot of companies with big presences here that aren't headquartered here, and some of the ones that are, like SAS, is an analytics company that does not do a lot of consumer marketing. So you're in a tough spot. So if you want AT&T to invest in your franchise, if you want Lexus, who they have a couple deals with, if you want companies like that, you better be nationally relevant. You better be a team that the networks want on TV. You better be competing for championships so you get all that extra airtime in the playoffs. So those two things go hand in hand, the competitiveness and the money. But yes, I would say that there is a definite focus on winning. And if you can't help him win because you're a broadcaster or a PR guy or a marketing guy, and you get in the way, you're going to be moved along pretty quickly.
Man, I really appreciate your time. Is there anything you can think to add that we didn't go over before I let you go, Luke?
No. I mean, I think he's a really interesting guy. He doesn't like to have a big public presence. But he's very sort of intense. It's one of the things you'll notice about him when you see him around, and he will be around, is you'll never see him in a suit. You'll never see him in a tie. I mean, he basically lives in Lululemon, lives in a hat. He's just basically has said he has enough money to wear whatever he wants, and this is what he wants to wear. He's a really good golfer.
Well, as a man who is currently wearing Lululemons and a hat right now, I can identify with that. I'm all in.
Right in. Yeah, when he bought the team, he mocked me for like always wearing like a sport coat and stuff like that, or suit, whatever. Sort of playfully, but that's not that you won't see him. When he bought the team, he's sitting between the old owner and Gary Bettman wearing joggers and a black sweatshirt and a hat. I think they actually made him take his hat off. I think they prevailed upon him to not wear a hat at the press conference. But, that's just sort of, it's a sort of a statement of his personality. He's just going to do things his way, whether you like it or not. But yeah, just it's been very interesting. I covered this team for so long with an owner who was basically absentee and bankrupt, that having an owner who's involved and present and willing to sort of support the team competitively, just from a sort of journalism perspective, it's just a completely different animal. You know, you're not spending all your time chasing these wild goose chases on, are the Hurricanes moving? You know, you do have to clear your schedule in April and May and June because they're going to make a long run in the playoffs. I mean, that's the thing. It's not just that they've made the playoffs. They've won a round every year he's owned the team. Nobody else has done that in that time period. So it's been very different. And I kind of feel vindicated in the sense that, having told him and other people, obviously, that this market is dormant, not dead. We've definitely seen it come back to life. I was right about that. And I feel pretty good about being right about that, because we as a market, you know, the sort of the triangle here, having a pro team in a very college focused market, it needs to be good to be relevant. Because you've got Carolina basketball and Duke basketball and NC State, which people outside the market don't understand what a big deal NC State is in both football and basketball. And Bill Belichick now, if you're going to be the hockey team here, you know, you need to be good. And they've reached a point now. I mean, the team's been here for almost 30 years. They've reached a point now where you have kids, you know, people who went to the first years of the games, their kids are going now. You know, it's not an issue NBA teams have, right? Nobody has to grow up learning how to be a basketball fan in the U.S. But certainly in North Carolina, you have to learn how to be a hockey fan. There's a kid in training camp now, or he's going to be in training camp with the team, who grew up here. He'll be really the first truly homegrown, not son of a player kid. He was drafted by Colorado. He's bounced around a little bit. He's kind of settled into a level as a minor league guy, but that's still noteworthy that there's a kid who grew up here, is playing hockey because of the Hurricanes, will be in training camp with them. So it's been sort of a long journey, but it's definitely different having an owner like Tom, who is a little more hands-on. You know, once all the arena stuff got done, things calmed down a lot because a lot of the sort of uncertainty went out the window, but it's definitely been interesting.
Well, Luke, it was a fascinating conversation, and you provided some wonderful insight. So I can't thank you enough for joining the podcast, and thank you for listening to the Oregonian Sports Podcast. If you like today's episode and you listen on Apple Podcasts, give us a 5-star rating and review. It helps people find the show. And as always, for more coverage of the Blazers, including the ongoing sale of the franchise, visit OregonLive.com/Blazers. Until next time, I'm Joe Freeman, and this was the Oregonian Sports Podcast.